On the 15th of August, 2021, the Taliban, armed with weapons and ammo, took the city of Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. Panic and chaos ensued as people swarmed the airports, and the world looked on in horror as bodies dropped from the exterior of an Air Force C-17, where people had been clinging to the landing gear in a desperate attempt to escape Afghanistan before it was too late. It was one of the biggest blunders of the Biden administration. The biggest, depending on who you ask, especially if you ask Afghan women, who were immediately expelled from high school and college and fired from their jobs and banned from public spaces like museums and parks. And of course, they are not allowed to leave their house without a full body covering, including covering their face.
The Taliban have forbidden women in Afghanistan from talking to each other, the latest in a series of increasingly draconian restrictions since the group seized power 3 years ago. The decree by the Taliban Minister for the Promotion of Virtue has prompted outrage, with one Afghan women's rights group describing it as heartbreaking and reflecting the Taliban's deep ignorance and dark-mindedness.
You're probably wondering, how could this happen on our planet in 2024? Let's get into it. Welcome to Swing Voter Central. On September 11th, 2001, the Twin Towers were struck by two commercial airplanes that had been hijacked by members of Al-Qaeda, a terrorist group that trained and operated in a Taliban-controlled region of Afghanistan. At that time, the Taliban was just a military group that was slowly but surely taking control of territories within Afghanistan. A terrorist attack of this magnitude is not something that we could just ignore. We absolutely had to respond. George Bush had to respond to the attack on 9/11, where 3,000 Americans died. Not only that, but the Taliban was refusing to extradite Osama bin Laden, who was the guy that planned the 9/11 attacks. The Taliban claimed that it violated their interpretation of Islamic law, some law of hospitality. So on October 7th, 2001, George W. Bush got on national television and announced that we were going to invade Afghanistan to fight Al-Qaeda and to help the Afghan military fight back the Taliban. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. Unfortunately, our war in Afghanistan ended up becoming another one of our forever wars. Eventually, George Bush started looking to Iraq and saying, oh, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. We have to invade Iraq. And it dragged on for decades and cost us trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives. 23 years has passed and nothing has changed. We know that because the minute we pulled out of Afghanistan, the Taliban swooped in and took over. 23 years of training the Afghan military to fight the Taliban, and the minute we pulled out, they literally ran. You've probably heard of the military base Bagram. Bagram Air Force Base is a really famous military base in Afghanistan that was famously abandoned by the Afghan military the minute the American military left. The Taliban was closing in on Bagram, and the soldiers of the Afghan army realized that they probably didn't stand a chance because the Taliban was packing $7 billion worth of military equipment that Joe Biden had left behind when he pulled us out of Afghanistan. The thing about our plan to withdraw from Afghanistan is that it had already been in the works since Obama. Congress under Trump was planning to pull us all out in May, and Biden extended that to August. The plan was solid. The execution was terrible. We pulled out so quickly that the Taliban was able to take over within a matter of weeks. As a matter of fact, 2 weeks before the last troop pulled out and came home to the United States, the Taliban had already begun their takeover. They started before we were even finished leaving. And today, they run Afghanistan. They are the governing body of Afghanistan. By now, in 2024, there is not a single politician left, pretty much, who would say that our 2001 invasion of Afghanistan was a good idea. Everybody admits that it was a huge mistake and an expensive one at that. Well, expensive for everybody except these guys, who had an amazing time frolicking through the Iraqi oil fields, snatching up contracts left and right, and making tens of billions of dollars. For everybody else, however, it was an incredibly expensive war that dragged on for 20 years and cost the American taxpayers $2 trillion. And it also cost lives. A suicide bomber carried out an attack at the Kabul airport amid all of the chaos when people were trying to escape, killing 13 US military personnel and 170 civilians. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was sloppy, it was too hasty, and it was deadly. And the thing that confuses me is that I watched Joe Biden's announcement of leaving Afghanistan, and he specifically said, we're not going to rush this, we're going to take our time, and we're going to do it responsibly and intelligently. And that was the opposite of what actually happened. And I'm not really sure why or how. And then after these people died, after the insanity ensued, he went back on national television, and I watched that entire speech this morning. Basically, what he said then was, this plan was created by the Trump administration, and we just felt obligated to carry it out because it had already been planned. What? What do you mean? You're supposed to say something like, oh yes, we reviewed the plan and it was, you could be honest. You could say that it was a good plan, poorly executed. Or you could say it was a bad plan and we should have known that. One of two things is true. Either it was a terrible plan and they went ahead with it anyway because it was already on the agenda, or it was a good plan that was badly executed. Either way, the blame is on the hands of the Biden administration. The way they handled Afghanistan was a disaster. I mean, let's just review a list of the equipment that was left behind and is now in the hands of the Taliban. 78 aircraft, over 22,000 Humvees, those big old cars that can drive very well in the desert, over 600,000 weapons, including M16 rifles, M4 carbines, light machine guns, and sniper rifles, large caches of ammunition, night vision devices and optics, body armor and protective gear, tools and materials for handling explosives, that's fun, fuel tankers and maintenance equipment, various encrypted communication devices, radios, and other secure communication technology, and finally, biometric devices that are used to identify, like facial recognition. And it included biometric data of Afghani spies that were spying on behalf of the United States. I don't know why this is not a bigger topic during the election. I mean, I guess that the Republicans are talking about it. I watched the Joe Rogan interview with Trump and they did mention it. They mentioned how sloppy the withdrawal from Afghanistan was, but I don't think it was talked about during the debate, was it? No, it wasn't. And they're definitely not talking about it that much on the news, but this was one of Biden's first big moves, his first historic moves, and it was terrible. The bottom line is that Americans are tired of forever wars. One of the biggest issues in this election is the concept of forever wars, and these wars that we get ourselves involved in that just go on for years and years with no progress, trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives lost, and nothing to show for it. And at this point, we have more oil than we could ever need under our own soil. So there's just no reason for us to be meddling in the Middle East anymore. But that doesn't change the fact that now that we've pulled out, the Taliban is in control of Afghanistan. Women have lost their rights. People are starving to death at rates that are beyond a humanitarian crisis at this point. And obviously, world governments are not going to be sending money to the Taliban. That's the hardest part. The people of Afghanistan are relying on humanitarian organizations who already have their hands full in Ukraine and in Gaza. And Afghanistan is suffering. And when I researched this subject before I made this video, I watched several documentary videos of families who are selling their 9-year-old and 8-year-old and 7-year-old daughters to old men to be able to afford to feed their other children. That is happening in Afghanistan. That is how poor they are.
But since the Taliban takeover 2.5 months ago, any money or assistance has dried up. And with 8 mouths to feed, Parwana's father is now doing the unthinkable. My father has sold me because we don't have bread, rice and flour. He has sold me to an old man. The white-bearded man who claims he's 55 years old comes to collect her.
People are just not happy with the way that this was handled. And it speaks a lot about how the Democrats, the Biden-Harris administration, handles foreign affairs. I think that should be something that we should consider when we're thinking about war in this election. I can't really speak much on the Trump administration as it pertains to war because there were no major wars that broke out during the Trump administration. We had peace on most fronts, and things were smoothing over with our adversaries like Putin, with Iran and China. Things seem to be somewhat smoothing out. And I don't really see why that's a bad thing. I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow in my episode on Ukraine. But yeah, this was just the beginning of Joe Biden's record on war. Come back tomorrow and we'll keep on talking about it. Thank you for watching Swing Voter Central.